In 1887, Wyoming, when a proud Apache woman was dragged onto the auction block as property, no one expected the quiet rancher in the back to tear up her bill of sale by dawn, or that their desperate marriage would ignite a war against the most powerful man in the territory. This is the story of Kiona and Beckett Shaw, whose union born from defiance would either save a county's soul or destroy them both. Stay with me until the end and comment your city so I can see how far this story travels across the world. The dust of Rawlins, Wyoming hung thick in the September air, carrying with it the stench of cattle unwashed bodies and something far more bitter human desperation. Sheriff Tully Rain stood at the edge of the courthouse square, his weathered hands gripping the porch rail as he watched the crowd gather around the makeshift auction platform. 23 years wearing a badge, and this was still the part of the job that made his stomach turn. Another shipment from the reservation troubles, Deputy Collins muttered beside him, spitting tobacco juice into the dirt. Army says they're all criminals, but hell, Sheriff, that one there don't look like no criminal to me. Tully's eyes followed Collins' gaze to the woman being dragged up the wooden steps. Even with her wrists bound and her traditional dress torn and dusty, she carried herself like royalty. Her long black hair hung loose around her shoulders, and when she lifted her chin to face the jeering crowd, Tully saw something in her dark eyes that made him look away, not shame or fear, but a pride so fierce it seemed to burn. "Kiona of the White Mountain Apache," the auctioneer called out, his voice carrying over the crowd. "Healthy young good for housework, or—" He paused with a leer that made several men in the crowd chuckle. "Well, whatever purposes a man might require." Tully's jaw tightened. The territorial law was clear. Apache prisoners could be sold into indentured servitude to pay for their crimes and upkeep. It was legal, which somehow made it worse than if it had been simple lawlessness. At least outlaws didn't hide behind paperwork. "Do I hear $50? The auctioneer continued. "50, called out Jake Morrison, a local shop owner known for his wandering hands and short temper. 60, this from Carl Peterson, who already had 2 Apache women working his farm under conditions that made Tully's skin crawl. The woman, Kiona, never flinched. She stood straight-backed, her gaze moving slowly across the crowd as if memorizing every face, every voice. When her eyes met Tully's, he saw something that chilled him. Not hatred, but judgment. She was taking their measure, all of them, and finding them wanting. 75, Morrison called again, stepping closer to the platform. "Let me get a better look at the merchandise." That's when Tully heard the voice from the back of the crowd, quiet, but carrying clearly in the dusty air. $100. Every head turned. Tully craned his neck to see over the crowd and spotted him, Beckett Shaw, standing apart from the others near his horse. Even at a distance, Tully could see the rigid set of the man's shoulders, the way his hands hung loose at his sides like he was preparing for trouble. Shaw was a mystery, and Rawlins had been, for the 3 years since he'd bought the old Henderson place north of town. Paid cash, kept to himself, came into town only for supplies. Some said he was running from something back east. Others claimed he'd been a soldier, though he never talked about the war. What everyone agreed on was that he minded his own business and expected others to do the same. "Did you say 100, the auctioneer asked, clearly surprised. Shaw stepped forward, the crowd parting before him. Up close, Tully could see the man's face, clearly sharp cheekbones, pale eyes that seemed to take in everything without giving anything back, and a scar that ran from his left temple to his jaw. He looked like a man who'd seen too much and decided the world wasn't worth the effort of engaging with it. "I did," Shaw said simply. Morrison wheeled around, his face flushed. "Now hold on just a minute, I was bidding fair and square." Shaw's pale eyes shifted to Morrison, and something in his expression made the smaller man take a step back. "You still can, bids 100, top it or step aside." 110, Morrison called out, but his voice cracked slightly. 125, Shaw replied without hesitation. The bidding continued, climbing higher with each exchange. Tully watched Shaw's face throughout, looking for some sign of what drove the man to bid on a human being like she was livestock. But Shaw's expression never changed, calm, almost bored, as if he was bidding on a plow or a milk cow instead of a woman's life. Finally, when the price reached $200 more than most men in Rollins made in 6 months, Morrison threw up his hands in disgust. "Hell with it," he spat. "Ain't no Apache worth that much, no matter how pretty." Shaw said nothing, just watched as the auctioneer banged his gavel. "Sold to Mr. Shaw for $200. The crowd began to disperse, muttering among themselves about city folks with more money than sense. Tully started to head back inside the courthouse, but something made him pause. He turned back to see Shaw walking toward the platform where Kiona still stood. She watched him approach with the same steady gaze she'd given the crowd, but Tully thought he detected something different now, a tension like a wildcat deciding whether to fight or flee. Shaw stopped at the base of the platform and looked up at her. "My name is Beckett Shaw," he said, his voice pitched low but clear enough for Tully to hear. "I have a ranch north of town. If you come with me, you'll have food, shelter, and safety. You'll also have my word that no man will harm you while you're under my protection." Kiona's eyes narrowed slightly. When she spoke, her English was clear and precise, with only the slightest accent. "And what do you want in return for this generosity?" Shaw was quiet for a long moment. "I want nothing from you that you don't choose to give." "Pretty words," she replied, "but I have seen how men keep their pretty words." Shaw nodded, as if he'd expected the response. He reached into his coat and pulled out a folded paper, the bill of sale the auctioneer had handed him moments before. Without breaking eye contact with Kiona, he tore it cleanly in half. The gesture sent a murmur through the remaining crowd. Jake Morrison let out a bark of laughter. "Well, I'll be damned," he called out. "Shaw just threw away $200. Maybe the sun's got to him." But Tully wasn't laughing. He could see something pass between Shaw and the Apache woman, a communication that went deeper than words. Shaw held out his hand to help her down from the platform. For a heartbeat, Kiona didn't move. Then slowly, she reached out and took his hand. "This don't change nothing legal-wise," the auctioneer protested. "You bought her fair and square, paper or no paper." Shaw turned toward the man, and his voice carried a note that made even Tully straighten. "If anyone has a problem with how I handle my affairs, they're welcome to discuss it with me directly." The auctioneer paled and took a step back. Shaw turned back to Kiona, who had stepped down from the platform, but remained wary like a deer ready to bolt. "The offer stands," Shaw said quietly, "but the choice is yours." Tully watched as Kiona studied Shaw's face, searching for deception or hidden intent. Whatever she saw there seemed to satisfy her because she gave a single sharp nod. "I will come," she said, "but understand this, Beckett Shaw, I am not your property. The paper you tore was never real to me. If I stay, it will be because I choose to stay. If I leave, it will be because I choose to leave." Shaw's mouth quirked in what might have been the beginning of a smile. "I wouldn't have it any other way." They walked toward Shaw's horse together, Kiona keeping pace beside him, rather than following behind. The remaining crowd watched in bemused silence as Shaw helped her mount, then swung up behind her. He gathered the reins and looked back toward the courthouse steps, where Tully still stood. Their eyes met across the dusty square, and Shaw touched the brim of his hat in acknowledgement. Then he turned his horse north and rode out of town with Kiona sitting straight-backed in front of him, her dark hair streaming in the wind. Tully stood there long after they'd disappeared from sight, thinking about the look in the woman's eyes and the way Shaw had torn up that paper. In all his years as sheriff, he'd seen plenty of men buy Apache prisoners. He'd never seen one set them free before they'd even left town. "Mighty strange business," Deputy Collins observed, rejoining him on the steps. "Strange times call for strange choices," Tully replied. But as he turned to go back inside, he couldn't shake the feeling that Beckett Shaw and Kiona had just set something in motion that would change Rollins forever. The ride north to Shaw's ranch took them through some of the most beautiful country in Wyoming territory, rolling hills covered in grassland that stretched to distant mountains with cottonwoods marking the path of creeks and streams. But neither Beckett nor Kiona seemed inclined to admire the scenery. They rode in silence for the first hour, each lost in their own thoughts. Beckett could feel the tension in Kiona's posture, the way she held herself ready to spring from the horse's back if necessary. He kept his touch light on the reins, careful not to make any sudden movements that might spook her. Finally, as they crested a hill that gave them a view of the valley beyond, Kiona spoke. "Why did you do it?" Beckett considered the question. It was one he'd been asking himself since the moment he'd raised his hand in that courthouse square. "Seemed like the right thing to do," he said finally. "The right thing." There was skepticism in her voice. White men have many ideas about what is right. Usually they benefit only the white man. "Can't argue with that," Beckett replied. "Most of the white men I've known haven't been worth the powder to blow them up. Yet you are a white man." "Last I checked, yes. So why should I trust you?" Beckett was quiet for a moment, studying the valley ahead. His ranch house was visible in the distance, a modest two-story building with a barn and several outbuildings scattered around it. "Because," he said finally, "I've seen what it's like to be owned by other men. Might not have been standing on an auction block, but the feeling's the same. Nobody should have to live like that." Kiona turned slightly in the saddle to look at him, her dark eyes searching his face. "You were a soldier." It wasn't a question. Beckett nodded. "The war between the North and South. 3 years with the Army of the Potomac. Saw Bull Run and Antietam, Gettysburg." His voice was matter-of-fact, but Kiona could hear the weight behind the words. "And after the war, came west, bought land, tried to forget." "Some things cannot be forgotten," Kiona said quietly. "No," Beckett agreed, "but they can be lived with." They rode the rest of the way in a different kind of silence, not the wary tension of before, but something approaching understanding. As they drew closer to the ranch, Beckett pointed out the various buildings. "House there, barn to the left, chicken coop behind that. Got about 50 head of cattle, mostly shorthorns. Nothing fancy, but it's honest work. You live alone, have for 3 years now. Gets quiet sometimes, but quiet's better than a lot of things." As they rode into the yard, a dog came bounding out from behind the barn, a large yellow mutt, with one ear that stood up and one that flopped down. The dog barked once, then seemed to take stock of the situation and approached more cautiously. "That's Rex," Beckett said, dismounting and offering his hand to help Kiona down. "He's got more sense than most people I know." Kiona studied the dog, who sat down and regarded her with intelligent brown eyes. Slowly, she extended her hand. Rex sniffed once, then pushed his head against her palm. "He likes you," Beckett observed. "Rex is a good judge of character." "Animals know truth," Kiona replied, scratching behind the dog's ears. "They do not know how to lie." Beckett led his horse toward the barn, gesturing for Kiona to follow. "House has 3 bedrooms upstairs, parlor, and kitchen downstairs. You can have your pick of the rooms, door locks from the inside." Kiona nodded, but her attention was focused on taking in her surroundings. The ranch was clearly well maintained, but not fancy, everything built for function rather than show. The barn was clean and organized. The house looked solid and weatherproof, and the few cattle visible in the nearby pasture appeared healthy and well fed. "You built all this yourself?" she asked. "Most of it. Hired help for the barn raising, but the rest I did with my own hands." There was quiet pride in his voice. As they walked toward the house, Kiona caught sight of a small garden plot near the kitchen door. Even in late September, she could see the remnants of what had been a productive growing season: tomato plants, heavy with late fruit rows of beans and squash herbs, growing in neat lines. "You grow food as well as raise cattle," she observed. "Man's got to eat," Beckett replied. Store-bought food gets expensive, and besides, there's something satisfying about eating what you've grown yourself. Kiona knelt beside the garden, examining the plants with the eye of someone who understood growing things. This is good soil, rich. The plants are healthy. You know about farming. Apache women learn many things: how to find food in the desert, how to make plants grow, how to preserve meat and vegetables for the winter. Her voice carried a note of sadness. Skills that are useless when you are locked away on reservation land that will not grow anything. Beckett was quiet for a moment. This land grows plenty. You're welcome to use the garden however you see fit. Kiona looked up at him, something shifting in her expression. You would trust me with your food. I figure anyone who can make plants grow in reservation soil can probably improve on what I've been doing out here. They continued toward the house, Rex trotting along beside them. As they climbed the front steps, Beckett paused with his hand on the door. I want to be clear about something, he said. I know what the law says about that paper I tore up. Far as the territory's concerned, you're still supposed to be working off your debt. But far as I'm concerned, you don't owe me anything. You're free to leave whenever you want. But if you do decide to stay, it would help if people thought you were here by choice rather than by law. What do you mean? Beckett opened the door and gestured for her to enter. If folks think you're here as a servant or prisoner, they'll expect certain things. They'll think they can treat you a certain way. But if they think you're here as... He paused, seeming to struggle with the words. As what? Kiona prompted. As a guest, as someone under my protection. Then they'll be more careful about how they act. Kiona stepped into the house, taking in the simple but comfortable furnishings: handmade furniture, a stone fireplace, books lining shelves along one wall. Everything was clean and orderly, but it had the feeling of a place where only one person lived. And how would we make people think such a thing? She asked. Beckett followed her inside, closing the door behind him. We tell them the truth, that you're here because you choose to be, not because the law says you have to be. The truth, Kiona repeated, and you think they will believe this truth? Maybe, maybe not, but it's what we tell them either way. Kiona moved to the window and looked out at the valley beyond. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. In the distance, she could see the lights of Rollins beginning to flicker on. In my tribe, she said quietly, we have a saying: the truth is like water. It always finds a way to flow, no matter what obstacles are placed in its path. Wise words, Beckett replied. My grandmother taught them to me. She said that lies require constant effort to maintain, but truth sustains itself. Kiona turned away from the window to face him. So I will tell you a truth, Beckett Shaw. I am tired of running. I am tired of being hunted like an animal. I am tired of having no place in this world that is safe. And then what would make you feel safe? Knowing that if I stay, it is because I choose to stay. Knowing that if I speak, someone will listen. Knowing that if I am threatened, someone will stand with me rather than turn away. Beckett met her gaze steadily. Those seem like reasonable things to want. Do they? In my experience, white men find Apache wants very unreasonable. Then you've been talking to the wrong white men. Kiona studied his face for a long moment, as if trying to read something written there in a language she was still learning. Finally, she nodded. I will stay, she said, for now, but I have conditions. Name them. I will not be your servant. I will contribute to the work of this place, but as a partner, not as property. Agreed. I will not change who I am to make others comfortable. I am Apache. I am proud of my people and my heritage. I will not pretend otherwise. Wouldn't want you to. And if the time comes when staying here puts either of us in danger, we will speak honestly about what must be done. Beckett nodded. Fair enough. Anything else? Kiona was quiet for a moment, then shook her head. Those are my conditions. Then we have an understanding. Beckett extended his hand. Partners. Kiona looked at his outstretched hand, then back at his face. Slowly, she reached out and grasped his hand in hers, not the tentative touch she'd given him in town, but a firm grip between equals. "Partners," she agreed. They stood there in the gathering twilight, two people from different worlds who had somehow found common ground in the middle of Wyoming territory. Outside, Rex barked once at something moving in the darkness, then settled down with a contented sigh. Neither Beckett nor Kiona could have known it then, but their handshake in that simple ranch house had just set in motion a chain of events that would test every promise they'd made to each other. In town, Wilson Hargrave was already hearing reports about the strange auction and the even stranger man who'd torn up a perfectly legal bill of sale. And Wilson Hargrave was not a man who tolerated challenges to the natural order of things, especially not challenges that involved Apache women and soft-hearted ranchers who didn't understand how the world really worked. But for now, in the quiet of the ranch house, with the stars beginning to appear overhead, Beckett Shaw and Kiona allowed themselves to believe that understanding and good intentions might be enough to keep the darkness at bay. They would learn soon enough how wrong they were. As night fell over the valley, Kiona stood at the upstairs window of what would be her room, looking out at the vast expanse of land stretching away in all directions. For the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt something that might have been hope stirring in her chest. But hope, she knew, was a dangerous thing for an Apache woman in white man's country. Hope could make you careless. Hope could make you forget that safety was always temporary and that there were men in the world who would destroy anything good simply because they could. Still, as she watched Beckett Shaw moving around the barn below, checking on his animals before bed, she allowed herself to think that maybe, just maybe, she had finally found a place where she could stop running. Time would tell if she was right. The first weeks passed like a careful dance between two people, learning each other's rhythms. Kiona rose before dawn, as was her way, and would find Beckett already in the barn tending to the horses. They worked alongside each other with an efficiency that surprised them both. She proved as capable with cattle as she'd claimed to be with crops, and he discovered that her knowledge of preserving food and reading weather patterns far exceeded his own. "Storm coming," Kiona announced one morning in early October, standing in the doorway of the barn with her face turned toward the western sky. "Big one, 2 days, maybe 3. Beckett looked up from the stall he was mucking. The sky appeared clear to him with only a few wispy clouds on the horizon. "You sure about that? The wind has changed. The cattle are restless. Even Rex feels it. See how his ears twitch." She gestured toward the dog, who was indeed acting skittish, pacing back and forth near the barn entrance. "If you're right, we'll need to bring the herd closer to shelter," Beckett said, trusting her judgment, even though his own senses detected nothing. "I am right," Kiona replied with quiet confidence. "Apache learn to read the sky or die." She was right. The storm hit 2 days later with a fury that rattled the windows and sent the temperature plummeting 20 degrees in as many minutes. They spent the day huddled in the house while wind howled outside and rain lashed the roof. By evening, when the worst had passed, they sat by the fire sharing a meal of preserved venison and root vegetables from the cellar. "How did you know?" Beckett asked, genuinely curious. Kiona poked at the fire with an iron rod, sending sparks spiraling up the chimney. "My grandfather taught me. He could read storms 3 days out, sometimes 4. He said the earth speaks to those who know how to listen." "What else did he teach you?" "Many things. How to track animals, how to find water in drought, how to treat wounds with plants." Her voice grew softer. "How to survive when the world tries to kill you." Beckett was quiet for a moment, studying her profile in the firelight. "Sounds like a wise man." He was. The soldiers killed him at Sand Creek. The words came out flat, emotionless, but Beckett could see the pain behind them. "I'm sorry." "Sorry does not bring back the dead." Kiona set down the poker and looked at him directly. "But it is more than most white men have offered." They fell into a comfortable silence, listening to the storm outside begin to subside. It was Beckett who finally spoke again. "I was at Andersonville," he said quietly. Kiona frowned. "I do not know this place." "Confederate prison camp. They kept us in a stockade like animals. No shelter, barely any food. Men died every day from disease, starvation, exposure." His hands tightened around his coffee cup. "I learned what it was like to be less than human in other men's eyes." "How long?" 8 months, felt like 8 years. Kiona studied his face, seeing new lines there that she hadn't noticed before. "Is that where you got the scar?" Beckett's hand moved unconsciously to the mark on his cheek. "Guard's bayonet. I was trying to help a friend who'd collapsed. Guard thought I was stealing his rations." "Your friend, did he live?" "No, died that night. But at least he didn't die alone." They sat in the growing darkness, each lost in memories of loss and survival. Outside, the wind was dying down, but neither of them felt inclined to break the spell of shared understanding that had settled between them. "Perhaps," Kiona said finally, "that is why you tore up the paper. You know what it is like to be owned." "Perhaps," Beckett agreed. The storm marked a turning point in their relationship. The careful politeness of the first weeks gave way to something deeper, not romance exactly, but a partnership built on mutual respect and shared experience. They found themselves talking more, sharing stories of their pasts and their hopes for the future. Kiona proved to be an excellent cook, turning the simple ingredients in Beckett's pantry into meals that reminded him why food was meant to be more than mere fuel. In return, he taught her to ride his horses. She was a natural sitting the saddle with the same proud bearing she brought to everything else. "You could hire yourself out as a riding instructor," he told her one afternoon as they returned from checking the cattle in the north pasture. "Apache women do not need instruction in riding," she replied with a hint of amusement. "We are born on horseback." "Could have fooled me. You ride like you and that horse share the same mind." "In a way we do. Horses are honest animals. They respond to confidence and clear intention. They care nothing for the color of your skin or the language you speak." "Wish more people were like horses," Beckett observed. "People are more complicated. They carry fear and hatred in their hearts. It poisons their ability to see clearly." As if summoned by her words, they crested a hill and saw 3 riders approaching from the south. Beckett recognized them immediately, Jake Morrison and 2 of his friends from town. His jaw tightened. "Trouble?" Kiona asked, noting his change in demeanor. "Could be. Morrison's not known for his friendly visits." They rode down to meet the men in the yard. Morrison sat his horse with the swagger of someone who believed himself important, while his companions flanked him like lieutenants. Rex emerged from the barn, hackles raised and teeth bared. "Shaw," Morrison called out as they approached. "We need to talk." "Then talk," Beckett replied, dismounting but keeping his hand near the rifle in his saddle scabbard. Morrison's eyes fixed on Kiona, who had also dismounted and stood beside Beckett with calm dignity. "It's about your situation here." "What situation would that be?" "Don't play dumb, Shaw. You know what people are saying. You got an Apache woman living in your house, acting like she's some kind of equal. It ain't right, and it ain't safe." "Safe for who?" Beckett's voice carried a warning note. "For decent folks. You got her riding around like she owns the place, talking back to white men in town. Sets a bad example for the other Indians." "What other Indians?" Kiona spoke for the first time, her voice carefully controlled. Morrison's face flushed. "See, that's exactly what I'm talking about. No Apache should be speaking to white men unless spoken to first." Beckett took a step forward. "Morrison, I'm going to give you about 10 seconds to get off my land before I help you leave." "Now hold on," one of Morrison's companions interjected. "We ain't looking for trouble, we're just trying to be helpful. Point out that you might not understand how things work around here." "How things work?" Beckett repeated slowly. That's right. See, there's a natural order to things. White folks on top, Indians on the bottom. When that order gets upset, bad things happen. People get hurt. The threat was barely veiled. Kiona felt Beckett's tension like a physical thing beside her, but she also sensed his control. This was a man who knew how to fight but chose his battles carefully. "Appreciate the concern," Beckett said with dangerous calm, "but I'm comfortable with how things are arranged on my land." Morrison leaned forward in his saddle. "Your land, maybe, but what about when you come to town? What about when she needs supplies or medical attention? You think people are just going to accept her acting like she's some kind of citizen? I think people will treat her with respect, or they'll answer to me. One man can't fight a whole town, Shaw. Maybe not, but I can sure as hell make it expensive for anyone who wants to try me." The standoff stretched taut between them. Rex continued to growl low in his throat, and Beckett's horse shifted restlessly, sensing the tension. Finally, Morrison straightened in his saddle. "You're making a mistake, Shaw. Mark my words, this is going to end badly for both of you." "That sounds suspiciously like a threat," Beckett replied. "Not a threat, a warning, from a concerned neighbor." Morrison wheeled his horse around and spurred it toward the road, his companions following. They rode hard, raising a cloud of dust that hung in the air long after they'd disappeared from sight. "Concerned neighbor," Kiona said dryly. "Morrison's always been a small man with big opinions." Beckett replied, but his expression remained troubled. That evening, as they sat on the front porch watching the sun set over the valley, Kiona brought up the encounter again. "Morrison was not alone in his thinking," she said quietly. "I saw the way people looked at us in town that first day. He speaks for many. Some, not all. Enough." She was quiet for a moment, then continued. "Perhaps it would be better if I stayed here when you go to town, avoided unnecessary complications." Beckett turned to look at her. "Is that what you want? What I want and what is wise are often different things." "I asked what you want." Kiona considered the question. In truth, she had grown to enjoy their trips to town together, the way Beckett introduced her simply as Kiona, without explanation or apology. The small acts of defiance, like holding doors open for her or asking her opinion on purchases. It was a kind of dignity she had almost forgotten existed. "I want to walk where I choose to walk," she said finally. "I want to speak when I have something to say. I want to be seen as a person, not a problem to be managed." "Then that's what we'll do. Even if it causes trouble. Especially if it causes trouble. The day we start hiding from the Morrisons of the world is the day we lose something important. And what is that? The right to live according to our own consciences instead of other people's fears." 3 days later, they rode into Rollins together for supplies. The reaction was immediate and unmistakable. Conversation stopped as they passed. Groups of men huddled together, pointing and whispering. Women pulled their children closer and stared with mixtures of curiosity and disapproval. At the general store, old Mr. Peterson, Carl's father, served them with cold efficiency, measuring out their flour and coffee with the air of a man handling something distasteful. When Kiona asked about the availability of certain herbs for cooking, he looked at her as if she'd committed a breach of etiquette simply by speaking. "Don't know nothing about Indian herbs," he said curtly. "Got what I got, nothing more." "She's asking about sage and thyme," Beckett interjected smoothly. "Common cooking herbs." "Oh." Peterson's face flushed slightly. "Well, sage I got. Thyme might have some in the back." As Peterson went to check, Kiona examined the fabric display, running her fingers over bolts of calico and cotton. The quality was poor compared to what she could have found in Santa Fe or Denver, but it would serve for basic needs. "That blue would suit you," Beckett observed, noting her interest in a bolt of deep indigo cotton. "It is beautiful," she agreed, "but impractical. Blue shows dirt too easily." Sometimes impractical is worth it for beautiful. Before Kiona could respond, the store bell chimed and Wilson Hargrave walked in. The effect was immediate. Peterson hurried out from the back room, suddenly all smiles and deference. Hargrave was a big man, well-dressed and imposing, with the bearing of someone accustomed to having his wishes anticipated. "Mr. Hargrave," Peterson gushed, "what can I do for you today, sir?" Hargrave's pale eyes swept the store, taking in Beckett and Kiona with the same casual assessment he might give cattle at market. "Just checking on things, Peterson, making sure everything's running smoothly." "Oh, yes, sir, very smoothly indeed." Hargrave approached the counter where Beckett stood waiting for their order to be completed. "Shaw, isn't it heard about your acquisition at the auction last month?" "Kiona," Beckett said simply. "This is Wilson Hargrave. He owns the Circle H Ranch." Kiona nodded politely but said nothing. Hargrave's attention fixed on her with uncomfortable intensity. "Fascinating," he murmured. "The stories I've heard don't do justice to the reality. You're quite striking, my dear." The endearment hung in the air like a slap. Beckett's body went rigid, but before he could respond, Kiona spoke. "Mr. Hargrave." Her voice was perfectly level, perfectly polite, and somehow more cutting than any insult could have been. Hargrave's eyebrows rose slightly. "Well trained, I see. Shaw, I tip my hat to you. Most men wouldn't have the patience to civilize one of them to this degree." "Kiona doesn't need civilizing," Beckett replied, his voice tight with controlled anger. "She was perfectly civilized when I met her." Of course," Hargrave waved a dismissive hand. "Poor choice of words, though I must say I'm curious about the arrangement you two have. Quite the topic of conversation around town." "I can imagine." "Oh, it's all very interesting. Some say you've gone soft, letting an Apache dictate terms in your own home. Others think you're playing a longer game, building trust before, shall we say, asserting your natural authority." Hargrave's smile was oily and knowing. "I suspect the truth is somewhere in between." Kiona's hands stilled on the fabric she'd been examining. The insult was carefully crafted, designed to demean them both, while maintaining plausible deniability. Beckett took a step closer to Hargrave. "I think," he said quietly, "you might want to reconsider your assumptions." "Oh, I don't assume anything, Shaw. I observe, I evaluate, and what I see is a man who's let sentiment cloud his judgment. Dangerous thing, sentiment can lead a man to make choices that hurt not just himself, but the community around him." "Mr. Hargrave," Kiona said, suddenly turning from the fabric display, "perhaps you could answer a question for me." Hargrave looked surprised but pleased by her attention. "Certainly, my dear. I am curious about something. Do you speak to all women with such familiar terms, or only those you believe have no men to defend their honor?" The temperature in the store seemed to drop 10 degrees. Hargrave's smile faltered, and Peterson made a small choking sound behind the counter. Beckett fought the urge to grin. "I meant no disrespect," Hargrave said stiffly. "Of course not. I am sure it was merely poor choice of words." Kiona's tone was perfectly innocent, throwing his own phrase back at him with surgical precision. Hargrave's face darkened. For a moment, the mask of civilized behavior slipped, revealing something cold and ugly beneath. Then he reasserted control, straightening his jacket and forcing his expression back to neutral. "Indeed. Well, Shaw, I hope you know what you're doing. The territory can be a dangerous place for those who stand out too much." "I'll keep that in mind," Beckett replied. Hargrave touched his hat brim and walked out without another word. The silence that followed was deafening. Peterson busied himself wrapping their purchases with hands that shook slightly. "That'll be $4.30, he mumbled. Beckett paid and gathered their packages. As they walked toward the door, Peterson called out hesitantly, "Miss, about them herbs you was asking after, I might be able to order some in special, if you was interested." Kiona turned back surprised by the offer. "That is very kind of you, Mr. Peterson." "Well, good cooking herbs are hard to find out here. Might be others interested too." It was a small gesture, but it carried weight. Peterson was offering a tiny act of recognition, perhaps even defiance of the social order that men like Hargrave enforced. Kiona understood its significance. "I would be very interested," she said warmly. "Thank you." Outside, they loaded their supplies into the wagon in silence. It wasn't until they were well clear of town that Beckett spoke. "That was well done back there." "Which part?" "All of it, but especially calling Hargrave out on his manners. Most men wouldn't have had the courage to do that, let alone with such style. He was testing us, testing to see if we would accept his rules for how we should behave." Kiona adjusted her position on the wagon seat. "I decided not to accept them." And Peterson's offer, unexpected but hopeful. Perhaps Morrison does not speak for everyone after all. They rode in comfortable silence for a while, each processing the morning's encounters. It was Kiona who eventually broke the quiet. "Hargrave is dangerous," she said simply. "I know. More dangerous than Morrison. Morrison is angry and stupid. Hargrave is angry and smart. I know that too." "What will we do?" Beckett considered the question as their wagon rolled through the valley toward home. Rex trotted alongside, occasionally darting off to investigate interesting scents before returning to his post. "We'll keep doing what we're doing," he said finally. "Live our lives according to our own choices. Be ready for trouble, but not go looking for it. And if trouble finds us anyway, then we'll deal with it together." Kiona nodded, but her expression remained troubled. She had seen men like Hargrave before, men who viewed the world as their personal property, and anyone who challenged that view as a threat to be eliminated. Such men did not simply allow defiance to pass unanswered. That night, as she stood at her bedroom window looking out at the valley, she found herself thinking about escape routes and places to hide. Old habits learned in childhood and reinforced by years of running. She had allowed herself to feel safe here, to believe that she had found a place where she could stop looking over her shoulder. But safety, she reminded herself, was always temporary, and men like Wilson Hargrave made sure it never lasted long. Down in the yard, Beckett was making his final rounds, checking the barn and ensuring all was secure for the night. Rex padded beside him, alert and watchful. Neither man nor dog noticed the three figures crouched behind the ridge overlooking the ranch, or the way the moonlight glinted off the metal in their hands. The watchers stayed until dawn, cataloging the ranch's defenses and routines before melting away into the landscape like ghosts. By the time Beckett and Kiona rose to begin another day, the men were already riding back toward town with detailed intelligence about everything they had observed. Wilson Hargrave received their report over breakfast, nodding thoughtfully as they described the layout of the buildings, the habits of the occupants, and the vulnerabilities they had identified. When they finished, he set down his coffee cup and walked to the window of his study. The Circle H Ranch sprawled across the horizon, a testament to his power and influence. Thousands of acres, hundreds of cattle, dozens of men who jumped when he spoke. He had built an empire through careful planning, ruthless execution, and an absolute refusal to tolerate challenges to his authority. Beckett Shaw represented such a challenge, not just because he had defied social convention by treating an Apache woman as an equal, but because his defiance encouraged others to question the natural order of things. Peterson's offer to order special herbs was just the beginning. If Shaw was allowed to succeed in his experiment, others might begin to think they could ignore Wilson Hargrave's preferences as well. That could not be permitted. Hargrave turned back to his men, his decision made. "I want to know everything about Shaw, where he came from, what he did in the war, whether he has family or connections elsewhere. I want to know about the woman too, her background, her tribal affiliations, any legal vulnerabilities we can exploit." "Yes, sir." And then we remind Mr. Shaw and his partner that there are consequences for disrupting the peace of our community. As his men filed out to begin their investigations, Hargrave remained at the window studying the vast expanse of his domain. Order was not a suggestion in Wilson Hargrave's world, it was a requirement, and he was prepared to do whatever it took to maintain it. The war for the soul of Rollins had begun, though Beckett and Kiona would not realize it for several more days. By then, the first shots would already have been fired. The first sign of trouble came 3 days later when they discovered 2 of their cattle with their throats cut in the north pasture. Beckett knelt beside the carcasses in the gray dawn light, his face grim as he examined the clean wounds. "This wasn't wolves," he said quietly. Kiona crouched beside him, studying the tracks in the soft earth around the dead animals. 3 men, maybe 4. They came on foot, led the cattle away from the herd before killing them. Why kill them here instead of stealing them? Because this is not about the cattle. Kiona stood brushing dirt from her hands. This is a message. Rex whined nervously from where he sat several yards away, reluctant to approach the carnage. Even the dog understood that something had changed, that the sanctuary they'd built together was no longer as safe as it had seemed. They buried the cattle and rode back to the house in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. As they approached the barn, Beckett noticed something that made him rein in sharply. "Stay back," he told Kiona, dismounting and drawing his rifle from the saddle scabbard. The barn door hung open, creaking in the morning breeze. Beckett always secured it at night, had done so religiously for 3 years. Now it swayed back and forth, revealing only darkness within. He approached cautiously, rifle ready, while Kiona remained mounted but within easy reach of her own weapon. The barn was a mess, feeds scattered across the floor, tools thrown about, stalls kicked in, but it was what he found in his workshop that made his blood run cold. Someone had taken an axe to his workbench, reducing months of careful craftsmanship to splinters. Hand tools lay bent and broken. Their wooden handles snapped like kindling. Most disturbing of all was what they'd done to the rocking chair. He'd been making a piece intended as a surprise for Kiona, carved with delicate Apache patterns he'd copied from one of her traditional baskets. The chair lay in pieces, deliberately destroyed with malicious precision. They were looking for something, Kiona observed from the doorway, or trying to send a message about the futility of building anything worth keeping, Beckett replied bitterly. The same message then. She moved into the barn, stepping carefully around the debris. They want us to know that nothing we create here is safe, that we have no right to build a life together. Beckett set his rifle aside and began gathering the scattered tools, his movements sharp with suppressed anger. "Well, they're going to be disappointed. Takes more than some night visitors to run me off my own land. And if next time they come for more than cattle and furniture?" The question hung between them, unspoken fears given voice. They both knew that this was escalation, a testing of resolve, a probing for weakness. The next move would likely be more direct, more personal. "Then we'll be ready for them," Beckett said firmly. But as they worked to clean up the destruction, both wondered privately what ready meant when facing an enemy with superior numbers and no apparent scruples about the methods they employed. The answer came that afternoon in the form of Sheriff Tully Raines, who rode up to the house with the weary expression of a man delivering bad news. He dismounted slowly, as if reluctant to begin the conversation that awaited him. "Beckett, Miss Kiona." He touched his hat brim respectfully. "I need to talk to you both." "Coffee's on," Beckett replied, leading them toward the house. "You look like you could use some." They settled in the kitchen, steaming cups between them, and Rex sprawled across the threshold like a furry sentry. Tully took a long sip before speaking, buying himself time to find the right words. "Got a report this morning," he began carefully. "Claim that there was some kind of disturbance out here last night. Gunshots shouting signs of a struggle." Beckett's cup stopped halfway to his lips. "Who filed this report?" "Anonymous tip. Someone rode into town early this morning, said they'd heard shooting and were concerned for your safety." Kiona felt ice settle in her stomach. "You came to check on our safety?" That's what I told myself I was doing, Tully admitted Alan. But I got to be honest with you both. There's more to it than that. The person making the report also suggested that maybe the trouble had to do with tensions over your living situation. Meaning what exactly? Beckett's voice carried a dangerous edge. Meaning there's folks who think having an Apache woman living free on a white man's ranch is bound to cause problems. They're saying maybe those problems have already started. The implications were clear. Someone was building a narrative, creating justification for whatever action they planned to take next. The destroyed property and dead cattle weren't just harassment, they were props in a larger story being constructed around Beckett and Kiona's relationship. "Sheriff," Kiona said quietly, "are we under suspicion of some crime?" Tully looked uncomfortable. "Not officially, but I got to ask, was there any trouble here last night? Any reason someone might have heard gunshots?" "None that we caused," Beckett replied, "though someone did pay us a visit while we were sleeping, killed 2 of my cattle and tore up my barn." "You see who did it?" "No, but I got my suspicions." "Care to share them?" Beckett glanced at Kiona, who gave him a slight nod. "Wilson Hargrave's been making it clear he doesn't approve of our arrangement. Yesterday in Peterson's store, he all but threatened us." Tully's expression didn't change, but something flickered in his eyes. "That's a serious accusation, Beckett." "It's a serious situation, Tully." The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, staring into his coffee, as if searching for answers in its dark depths. When he looked up, his face showed the strain of a man caught between duty and conscience. "Here's what I can tell you," he said finally. "Officially, I'm investigating reports of disturbances on your property. I'll need to take a look around, file a report. Unofficially, you two need to be very careful. There's forces at work here bigger than just neighborhood complaints." "What kind of forces?" Kiona asked. "The kind that own judges and politicians. The kind that can make legal troubles appear out of thin air or make legal protections disappear just as fast." Tully stood, settling his hat back on his head. "I'll do what I can to keep things fair and legal, but my influence only goes so far." After he left, having dutifully examined and documented the vandalism, Beckett and Kiona sat on their front porch, watching the sun set over the valley. The beauty of the landscape felt brittle now, like something that could shatter at any moment. "We could leave," Kiona said softly. "Go to California or maybe Colorado. Start over somewhere else. Is that what you want?" She was quiet for a long time, considering. "Part of me does. The part that remembers what it's like to run, to always be looking over my shoulder. But another part—" She paused, searching for words. "Another part is tired of letting evil men drive good people from their homes. Even if staying means fighting a war we might not win. Especially then. My grandfather used to say that the only way evil triumphs is when good people decide that fighting back costs too much." Beckett nodded slowly. "Then we stay, but we do it smart. No more working alone, no more leaving the ranch unguarded. And we start building alliances." "With who?" "You heard the sheriff. Most of the power in this county belongs to Hargrave." "Most, not all." Beckett leaned forward, his mind already working through possibilities. "There's people in town who aren't comfortable with the way things are going. Peterson offering to order those herbs for you, that wasn't just about business. That was him taking a stand, small as it was. One shopkeeper against a cattle baron. One shopkeeper who's lived in this town longer than Hargrave's been here. Who knows where other bodies are buried, who remembers when things were different." Beckett stood pacing to the porch rail. "We need to find out who else might be willing to stand up. Quietly, carefully, but we need to know who our friends are." The opportunity came sooner than expected. The next morning brought a visitor in the form of Mrs. Eleanor Dayton, a widow who ran a small boarding house in town. She arrived in a battered wagon pulled by a horse that had seen better days, her gray hair pinned severely back, and her dress the practical black of a woman who'd learned to fend for herself. "Mr. Shaw, Miss Kiona," she called out as she climbed down from the wagon. "I hope you don't mind me calling uninvited." "Not at all, ma'am," Beckett replied, moving to help her with a large basket she was lifting from the wagon bed. "What brings you out our way?" Mrs. Dayton's eyes were sharp and intelligent as she looked between them. "I heard about the troubles you've been having. Thought you might appreciate some neighborly support." She opened the basket to reveal fresh bread, preserved fruits, and what appeared to be a complete dinner wrapped in clean cloth. But it was what lay beneath the food that made Kiona catch her breath. A beautifully worked Apache basket, its geometric patterns intricate and perfect. "This belonged to my late husband's first wife," Mrs. Dayton explained, noting Kiona's reaction. "She was Cheyenne. Thomas met her when he was trading up north, married her according to her people's customs. She died of fever the winter before I met him, but he kept her belongings, said they were too beautiful to throw away." Kiona lifted the basket reverently, running her fingers over the tight weaving. "It is exquisite work. She was very skilled. Thomas always said she was the finest woman he'd ever known. Smart, strong, could make something beautiful out of nothing at all." Mrs. Dayton's voice softened with memory. "He told me once that marrying her taught him that love doesn't recognize the boundaries that men try to draw between peoples." The message was clear, and both Beckett and Kiona understood its significance. Dayton was telling them that they weren't the first interracial couple in Rollins, and that not everyone in town viewed such relationships as scandalous. "Would you like to come in for coffee?" Kiona offered. "I'd be honored." They spent the morning on the front porch, Mrs. Dayton proving to be excellent company with a dry wit and an encyclopedic knowledge of local history. She told them stories of the early days of Rollins, when it had been a rough frontier town where survival mattered more than social conventions. "Wilson Hargrave didn't arrive until 1882, she said, sipping her coffee. Town was already established by then, had its own character, but money talks, and Hargrave had plenty of it. Started buying up land, hiring men, making it clear that things were going to be done his way from then on." "What changed?" Beckett asked. "Fear changed. People who used to speak their minds started keeping quiet. Businesses that used to serve everyone started getting particular about their customers. Families that had been here for years started feeling like strangers in their own town. And nobody fought back." Mrs. Dayton's expression darkened. "Oh, some tried. Tom Bradley ran against Hargrave's candidate for mayor in '84, had an accident with his wagon 2 days before the election. Sarah Mitchell started a women's committee to address some of the problems at the saloons. Committee disbanded after her boarding house had a mysterious fire. The pattern was clear, systematic intimidation designed to crush opposition before it could organize. But Mrs. Dayton's presence here suggested that the intimidation hadn't been entirely successful. "Why are you telling us this?" Kiona asked gently. "Because what you two are doing, living according to your own conscience instead of other people's fears, it gives some of us hope that maybe things don't have to stay the way they are." Mrs. Dayton set down her cup and looked directly at both of them. "Also, because you're going to need allies for what's coming." "What do you mean?" "I mean, Wilson Hargrave doesn't make idle threats. He's been asking questions about you both, hiring men to dig into your backgrounds. Word is, he's building some kind of case." Beckett felt his chest tighten. What kind of case? Legal kind. Something about violations of territorial law regarding Indian prisoners, maybe accusations of harboring fugitives. Details are scarce, but the intent is clear. He wants you gone, and he's going to use the law to do it. The implications hit them like a physical blow. If Hargrave could manufacture legal justification for separating them, all their defiance would mean nothing. Kiona could be dragged back to a reservation, or worse, while Beckett faced imprisonment or financial ruin. "How long do we have?" Kiona asked. "Hard to say. Could be days, could be weeks. Depends on how long it takes him to find a judge willing to sign the right papers." They sat in silence, absorbing this new threat. Mrs. Dayton watched them both carefully, as if gauging their resolve. "There might be another way," she said finally. "What way?" "Legal protection. Something that would make it much harder for Hargrave to use territorial law against you." Beckett frowned. "I'm not following." Mrs. Dayton glanced between them, then smiled slightly. "Marriage, Mr. Shaw. Legal official recorded in the county books marriage. Territorial law is very specific about the rights of married women, even Indian women married to white men. Much harder to claim someone's a fugitive or a vagrant when they're legally someone's wife." The suggestion hung in the air between them. Beckett and Kiona looked at each other, a dozen unspoken conversations passing in the space of a heartbeat. "Mrs. Dayton," Kiona said carefully, "are you suggesting we marry for legal protection rather than other reasons?" "I'm suggesting that sometimes the heart and the head point in the same direction, even if the timing isn't what you might have chosen." The older woman's eyes twinkled with something that might have been mischief. "Besides, from where I sit, it looks like you two have built something worth protecting. Might as well make it official." That evening, after Mrs. Dayton had returned to town with promises to keep them informed of developments, Beckett and Kiona found themselves back on the porch, wrestling with the decision that lay before them. "It would be a marriage of convenience," Kiona said, though her voice lacked conviction. "Would it?" Beckett replied quietly. She looked at him, seeing something in his expression that made her heart beat faster. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere along the way, this stopped being just about giving you a safe place to stay. For me, anyway." Kiona was quiet for a long moment, processing his words and her own feelings. When did I fall in love with you?" Beckett smiled ruefully. "Probably the day you corrected Hargrave's manners in Peterson's store. Maybe before that. Hard to say exactly when partnership becomes something deeper." "Love," Kiona repeated softly, testing the word. "I know it complicates things. I know we're from different worlds, that there are people who'll never accept us. But I also know that I can't imagine my life without you in it anymore." Kiona stood and walked to the porch rail, looking out at the valley that had become home. Behind her, she could feel Beckett waiting, not pushing, just giving her space to think. "In my culture," she said finally, "marriage is not just between two people. It is between families, between communities. It creates bonds that extend far beyond the couple themselves. And here we have no families to bind together, no communities that will celebrate our union." She turned back to face him. "We would be creating something entirely new. Does that frighten you?" "Yes." Her honesty was stark, uncompromising, but not as much as the thought of losing what we've already built. Beckett stood and moved to join her at the rail. "Then marry me, Kiona. Not just for protection, though we need that. Not just for defiance, though there's that too. Marry me because together we're stronger than either of us could be alone." She looked at him for a long moment, seeing the man who had torn up her bill of sale, who had stood beside her against Morrison's threats, who had built a life where she could speak freely and walk with dignity. "Yes," she said simply. They were married 3 days later in Sheriff Rain's office, with Mrs. Dayton and Dr. Mills serving as witnesses. The ceremony was brief and businesslike, but when Beckett slipped a simple gold band onto Kiona's finger, a ring that had belonged to his mother, there was nothing artificial about the emotion in his eyes. "By the authority vested in me by the territory of Wyoming," Sheriff Rains intoned, "I now pronounce you husband and wife." The kiss that followed was gentle, almost tentative, as if they were both still adjusting to the reality of what they'd just done. But when they broke apart, Kiona saw something in Beckett's face that she'd never seen before, a completeness, as if a missing piece had finally clicked into place. "Mrs. Shaw," he said softly, testing out her new name. "It will take some getting used to," she replied, but she was smiling. Dr. Mills cleared his throat awkwardly. "If I might, there's something you should both know about why I agreed to witness this ceremony." They turned toward him, noting the serious expression on his weathered face. "Dr. Mills was a small, neat man who'd served the community faithfully for over a decade, but he rarely involved himself in political matters. My daughter, he continued quietly, disappeared 6 months ago. 23 years old school teacher, sweet as summer rain. One day she was here, the next she was gone. No note, no explanation, no trace. I'm sorry, Kiona said gently. That must be terrible for you. It is. But here's the thing, she wasn't the only one. 3 other young women have vanished from towns within 100 miles of here, all unmarried, all without strong family connections to protect them. Beckett felt ice form in his veins. What are you saying, Doc? I'm saying there's something rotten happening in this territory, and I suspect Wilson Hargrave knows more about it than he's letting on. My Emma was asking questions about working conditions at some of the ranches, particularly how the Indian women were being treated. Next thing I know, she's gone. The implications were staggering. If Hargrave was involved in trafficking women, it would explain his particular interest in Kiona and his determination to break up her relationship with Beckett. Why haven't you gone to the territorial authorities? Beckett asked. With what evidence, suspicions, hunches? Dr. Mills shook his head bitterly. Hargrave has friends in high places. Without proof, I'd just be another grieving father making wild accusations. But if we could find proof, then maybe we could save not just yourselves, but other women who might be in danger. Sheriff Raines, who had been listening quietly, finally spoke. This is dangerous talk, Doc. If you're right about Hargrave, then going up against him isn't just about local politics anymore. It's about taking on organized crime. I know, Dr. Mills replied, but I also know I can't stand by and do nothing while more women disappear. As they left the sheriff's office, newly married and carrying the weight of Dr. Mills' revelation, Beckett and Kiona felt the ground shifting beneath their feet once again. What had begun as a personal struggle for dignity and freedom was transforming into something much larger and more dangerous. We're in over our heads, Kiona observed as they rode home. Probably, Beckett agreed. Question is, does that change anything? Kiona considered this as their wagon rolled through the valley toward the ranch. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and reds, and somewhere in the distance a coyote called to its pack. It was beautiful country worth fighting for, but the fight was becoming more complex with each passing day. No, she said finally, it doesn't change anything. If Hargrave is what Dr. Mills believes him to be, then stopping him becomes even more important. Even if it costs us everything. Everything we've built here is already at risk. At least this way, we fight for something bigger than just ourselves. That night, their first as husband and wife, they lay in the same bed for the first time since Kiona had arrived at the ranch. The physical intimacy was new and tentative, but the emotional connection felt as natural as breathing. No regrets, Beckett asked softly, holding her close in the darkness. About marrying you, none. Kiona was quiet for a moment. About what we're walking into, many. We could still leave, take our marriage certificate and start over somewhere else. We could, she agreed, but we won't. Why not? Because running away won't save Dr. Mills' daughter or the other women who might disappear if we're not here to help stop it. Beckett pressed a kiss to the top of her head, marveling at how completely his life had changed since that day at the auction block. He'd bought Kiona's freedom thinking he was saving one person, but somehow she'd ended up saving him, instead from loneliness, from cynicism, from the kind of moral cowardice that let evil flourish unchallenged. I love you, he whispered into the darkness. I love you too, she replied, and meant it with every fiber of her being. Outside their window the night was still and peaceful, but both of them knew it was the calm before the storm. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, new tests of the bond they'd forged. But tonight they were simply Beckett and Kiona Shaw, two people who'd found something worth fighting for in each other and in the life they'd built together. It would have to be enough to sustain them through the battle that was coming. The attack came 2 weeks after their wedding, swift and brutal in the pre-dawn darkness. Beckett woke to the smell of smoke and Rex's frantic barking, his military instincts kicking in before his mind fully processed what was happening. "Fire," he said sharply, shaking Kiona awake. "Get dressed, now." They stumbled into their clothes as orange light flickered through the bedroom window. Outside, they could see flames consuming the barn, the dry wood catching with terrifying speed. But it was the sight of mounted figures silhouetted against the fire that made Beckett's blood run cold. "How many?" Kiona asked, checking the load on her rifle with practiced efficiency. 6, maybe 8. They're not trying to hide." Beckett moved to the window, studying the scene below. "This isn't random. They want us to see them." The riders sat their horses in a loose semicircle around the burning barn, making no attempt at concealment. One of them raised his hand, and a voice carried clearly across the yard. "Shaw, come out and talk like a civilized man." Beckett recognized the voice, not Hargrave himself, but his foreman, a hard case named Crude Jameson, who drifted into the territory the previous year with the kind of reputation that made decent folks cross the street. "What do you want, Jameson?" Beckett called through the window. "Just to deliver a message from Mr. Hargrave. Says he's sorry to hear about your barn burning down. Terrible accident these dry autumn nights." "Accident," Kiona said grimly, watching the flames consume months of Beckett's work. "He also says he might be able to help you out," Jameson continued. "Got a generous offer for your land, fair market price. Might be wise to consider it, seeing as how accidents seem to follow you around." Beckett felt rage building in his chest, but kept his voice level. "Tell Mr. Hargrave I'm not interested in selling." "That's a shame, Shaw, really is, because accidents have a way of getting worse when folks don't pay attention to friendly warnings." One of the other riders spurred his horse forward, and in the firelight Beckett could see something dark in his hands. The man flung it toward the house, and it landed with a wet thud on the front porch. Rex immediately began barking with a different tone, not alarm but grief. Even through the closed door they could smell what the rider had thrown. "That's one of your steers," Jameson called out cheerfully. "Found it wandering where it shouldn't have been. Mr. Hargrave doesn't like trespassers on his land." The threat was clear. They were claiming the right to kill Beckett's cattle anywhere they found them, using property disputes as justification for destroying his livelihood. "You boys better move along," Beckett called back. "Fire department might be here soon." Jameson's laughter echoed across the yard. "Fire department, Shaw, the nearest fire wagon is 40 miles away in Cheyenne. By the time help arrives, there won't be nothing left but ashes." As if to emphasize his point, part of the barn's roof collapsed with a shower of sparks that lit up the night. The men whooped and hollered like they were watching a fireworks display instead of a man's livelihood going up in smoke. "We'll be going now," Jameson announced, "but don't worry, we'll be back to check on you real soon. Make sure you're getting along all right." The riders wheeled their horses and disappeared into the darkness, leaving behind the roar of flames and the acrid smell of burning wood. Beckett and Kiona stood at the window watching their barn collapse into glowing embers. "It's not safe to go out there yet," Beckett said, though every instinct screamed at him to fight the fire. "The animals turned them out to pasture yesterday. They should be far enough away to be safe." They spent the rest of the night watching the barn burn to nothing, taking with it tools, feed, and equipment that represented years of careful accumulation. By dawn, only the stone foundation remained blackened and cracked from the heat. 20 years of work, Beckett said quietly, surveying the ruins. "It can be rebuilt," Kiona replied, though her voice carried its own weight of grief. "With what money that barn represented, most of my savings converted into lumber and nails." They stood together in the morning light, ash drifting down like gray snow around them. Rex whined softly and pressed against Kiona's legs, seeking comfort in the face of destruction he couldn't understand. "This is just the beginning," Kiona said finally. Next will be the house, then the cattle, then us. Beckett nodded grimly. Unless we do something to stop it. What can we do? Go to the sheriff, file a complaint. The bitterness in her voice was sharp as broken glass. Jameson and his men will claim they were never here. Hargrave will express sympathy for our loss, and maybe even offer to help rebuild. There might be another way, Beckett said slowly. What way? Fight back, not with law, but with justice. Kiona turned to study his face, seeing something there that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with this quiet man. You're talking about war. I'm talking about survival. Hargrave's not going to stop until we're gone or dead. Question is whether we go quietly or make him pay a price for victory. The sound of approaching hoofbeats interrupted their conversation. A single rider was coming up the valley at a gallop, raising a cloud of dust in the morning air. As he drew closer, they recognized Dr. Mills, his normally neat appearance disheveled with haste. "Dear God," he breathed, pulling up short at the sight of the destroyed barn. "Are you both all right?" "We're fine," Beckett replied. "Property damage only." "This time," Dr. Mills said grimly. He dismounted and approached them, his face grave with more than just concern about the fire. "I came as soon as I heard, but there's more. Mrs. Dayton sent me to find you. Something's happened." "What kind of something?" Kiona asked. "The kind that changes everything." Dr. Mills glanced around nervously, as if expecting Hargrave's men to materialize from the smoking ruins. "We need to get you into town. There's someone you need to meet." An hour later, they sat in the back room of Mrs. Dayton's boarding house, listening to a story that made the burning of their barn seem like a minor inconvenience. The person they'd come to meet was a young Apache woman named Winter Fox, and the tale she told was one of horror and systematic abuse. "I am cousin to Kiona," Winter Fox said in careful English, her dark eyes never leaving Kiona's face. "Daughter of her mother's sister. I have been searching for her for many months." Kiona leaned forward, her heart racing. She hadn't seen Winter Fox since they were both children, but the family resemblance was unmistakable. "How did you find me?" "Stories travel even to the reservation. Stories of an Apache woman who married a white man, who walks free in the white man's world." Winter Fox's expression was both proud and fearful. "I came because I bring warning and because I carry proof of crimes that must be answered." She reached into her traveling bundle and withdrew a leather portfolio, its edges worn from handling. Inside were documents, photographs, and what appeared to be personal effects. "For 2 years, young women have been disappearing from reservations across the territory," Winter Fox continued. "Not just Apache, but Cheyenne, Lakota, Arapaho. Always the same pattern: girls without strong family protection, taken in the night, never seen again." Dr. Mills leaned forward intently. "How many that we know of?" "Perhaps 30. But there could be more. The reservations are told these women ran away, chose to leave. The authorities say they cannot track every Indian who decides to abandon the white man's generosity." The sarcasm in her voice was bitter as winter wind. Mrs. Dayton poured coffee with hands that shook slightly, the reality of what they were hearing settling over the room like a shroud. "But you have proof they didn't run away," Beckett said. Winter Fox nodded and began laying out photographs on the table. The images were disturbing: young women in chains, cowering in what appeared to be crude barracks, their eyes holding the hollow look of those who had given up hope. These were taken by a man who had second thoughts about his employer, Winter Fox explained, a photographer hired to document what he was told was a study of Indian assimilation. He realized too late what he was really documenting. Kiona studied the photographs with growing horror. Where are these places? Scattered across 3 territories. Remote ranches, abandoned mining camps, places where screams cannot be heard. Winter Fox's voice remained steady, but tears tracked down her cheeks. "The women are sold like cattle, some to brothels, some to men who want Indian wives they can treat as slaves, some to—" She trailed off, unable to voice the other possibilities. And Hargrave is involved in this, Mrs. Dayton asked. More than involved. He is one of the organizers. His ranch serves as a collection point before the women are moved to their final destinations. Winter Fox pulled out another document. This is a letter written by one of the missing women before she died. She managed to get it to a sympathetic guard who eventually gave it to the photographer. Beckett read the letter aloud, his voice growing harder with each word. They brought us here in chains and told us we would be trained for domestic service, but the training is not for cooking or cleaning. They are breaking us one by one until we forget we are human. The white men who visit pay money to do whatever they wish. Those who resist are killed as examples. I do not think I will live to see another winter, but maybe someone will remember that we existed. The silence that followed was deafening. Each person in the room was processing the magnitude of what they'd learned, the scope of evil that had been operating in their midst. Why hasn't this been reported to territorial authorities? Beckett asked finally. It has, Winter Fox replied bitterly, multiple times. But Hargrave has friends in high places, and Apache accusations against white ranchers are not taken seriously. We are told there is insufficient evidence or that the women probably left voluntarily. But now you have photographs, letters, witness testimony, Mrs. Dayton pointed out. Yes, but I also have something else. Winter Fox reached into her bundle one more time and withdrew a small leather book, its pages filled with careful handwriting. Names, dates, locations, a complete record of the operation kept by someone on the inside. Dr. Mills took the book with reverent care, scanning the entries. This is incredible. Financial record shipping manifests correspondence with buyers. How did you get this? The photographer who took the pictures was more than just having second thoughts. His own daughter was taken. He decided to gather evidence and expose the entire operation, but Hargrave discovered what he was doing. Winter Fox's voice dropped to a whisper. They found his body in a ravine 3 weeks ago, made it look like a riding accident. But he'd already given you the records, Kiona said. Yes, along with instructions to find you. He said that if anyone could help bring justice, it would be the Apache woman who had found a way to marry into the white man's legal protection. The weight of expectation settled over Kiona like a heavy blanket. These women, these families were looking to her for salvation she wasn't sure she could provide. What do you expect us to do? She asked quietly. Help me get this evidence to someone who will act on it, someone beyond Hargrave's reach, with the authority to investigate and prosecute. That would be federal authorities, Dr. Mills observed. Territorial marshals, maybe someone from the Justice Department in Washington. The nearest federal marshal is in Denver, Mrs. Dayton said. 200 miles of dangerous country, especially for someone carrying evidence against Wilson Hargrave. I will go, Winter Fox said simply, but I cannot go alone. The men who killed the photographer are still looking for this evidence. They will kill anyone who tries to expose their crimes. Beckett and Kiona exchanged glances, both understanding what was being asked of them. This wasn't just about their own fight with Hargrave anymore. It was about dozens of missing women, about a systematic evil that would continue unless someone stopped it. When do we leave? Kiona asked. Beckett looked at her sharply. Kiona, if you're caught with that evidence. If I'm caught without it, I could be next, she replied firmly. Don't you see, as long as Hargrave is operating freely, no Apache woman in this territory is safe. Not on reservations, not in towns, not even married to white men. The truth of it was undeniable. Hargrave's operation represented a threat to every native woman in the region, and Kiona's relative safety was an illusion that could be shattered at any moment. Then we all go, Mrs. Dayton announced, causing everyone to stare at her. What, you think a woman my age can't handle a wagon trip to Denver? Mrs. Dayton, this could be extremely dangerous, Dr. Mills protested. Dr. Mills, I've been living in dangerous times for years. At least, this way, I'm doing something about it. instead of just surviving it. They spent the rest of the day planning the journey, mapping routes and gathering supplies. The trip to Denver would take at least a week, assuming good weather and no interference from Hargrave's men. They would travel in 2 wagons, Dr. Mills and Mrs. Dayton in one Beckett and the 2 Apache women in the other. "We leave at first light," Beckett decided, "before anyone in town notices we're gone." But as they prepared to depart Mrs. Dayton's boarding house that evening, Sheriff Raines appeared at the back door, his expression grim. "Going somewhere, folks?" he asked quietly. The group froze, uncertain whether they'd been betrayed or if the sheriff was there to help. Raines stepped into the room and closed the door behind him, his eyes taking in the evidence spread across the table. "Relax," he said, seeing their tension. "I'm not here to stop you, I'm here to warn you." "Warn us about what?" Beckett asked. "Hargrave knows something's up. He's got men watching all the roads out of town, especially the ones leading toward Denver. Whatever you're planning, he's planning to stop it." Dr. Mills slumped in his chair. "Then we're trapped." "Maybe not," Raines continued. "There's an old mining road that cuts through the mountains north of here. Hasn't been used in years, barely passable, but it connects to the main Denver road about 50 miles out. Hargrave's men might not think to watch it." "Might not?" Winter Fox asked. "It's the best chance you've got, unless you want to wait and see if Hargrave gets tired of playing games and decides to finish this permanently." As if summoned by the sheriff's words, the sound of multiple horses approaching echoed through the night air. Raines moved to the window and peered through the curtains, his face darkening. "Speaking of finishing things," he muttered, "Hargrave's here himself with about a dozen men." They could hear voices in the street now, Hargrave's distinctive tone carrying clearly through the walls. "Sheriff Raines, I know you're in there. Come out so we can have a civilized conversation." Raines looked at the group huddled in Mrs. Dayton's back room. "Is there another way out of here?" "Root cellar," Mrs. Dayton replied quickly. "Connects to the storm drain that runs under Main Street. Comes out behind Peterson's store." "Take it. I'll buy you as much time as I can." "Sheriff," Kiona said urgently, "he'll know you helped us." "Let me worry about that. You just worry about getting that evidence to Denver." They gathered the documents quickly, Winter Fox securing them in her traveling bundle while Beckett and Dr. Mills collected their weapons. The sound of boots on the front porch added urgency to their movements. "Sheriff," Hargrave's voice was closer now, "I'm not a patient man." Mrs. Dayton led them to a concealed trapdoor in her pantry floor. The space below was cramped and dark, but a narrow tunnel led away from the house toward the commercial district. "Follow this about 200 yards, she whispered. "You'll come up behind Peterson's store. Your horses are in the stable behind the church." "What about you?" Kiona asked. "I'm staying to help the sheriff. Someone needs to tell Hargrave you've all gone to Cheyenne or some other place entirely." There was no time for extended goodbyes. One by one, they dropped into the tunnel, Winter Fox clutching the evidence that could bring down Hargrave's entire operation. Behind them, they could hear Sheriff Raines opening the front door and greeting their pursuers with forced joviality. "Wilson, what brings you out on such a fine evening?" The tunnel was a nightmare of mud cobwebs and uncertain footing, but it delivered them to freedom. They emerged behind Peterson's store to find their horses waiting as promised, along with supplies for the journey ahead. "The mountain road," Dr. Mills whispered as they mounted. "North until we hit the old mining trail." They rode out of Rollins in silence, keeping to back alleys and side streets until they reached the edge of town. Only when they were well clear of the last buildings did they allow themselves to hope they'd escaped undetected. But behind them, in Mrs. Dayton's boarding house, Sheriff Raines was discovering just how far Wilson Hargrave was willing to go to protect his interests. The conversation that had begun with forced politeness was rapidly deteriorating into something much more dangerous. "I'm disappointed, Sheriff," Hargrave was saying, his men spreading through the house to search for signs of recent occupancy. "I'd hoped we could resolve this matter quietly between gentlemen." "Don't know what matter you're referring to, Wilson." the matter of harboring fugitives and interfering with legitimate business operations. What fugitives would those be? Hargrave's smile was cold as winter ice. The Apache women who've been spreading lies about respected members of our community. The doctor who's been making wild accusations without evidence. The rancher who's forgotten his place in the natural order of things. Sounds like you're describing law-abiding citizens to me. Law-abiding. Hargrave's tone suggested he found the concept amusing. Sheriff, I think it's time we discussed your understanding of the law in this county. The threat was unmistakable, and Rains felt his hand drift toward his sidearm, but Hargrave's men were positioned strategically throughout the room, and Mrs. Dayton was still present. Any violence would endanger an innocent woman. My understanding of the law comes from 23 years of enforcing it fairly and honestly, Rains replied. Admirable sentiments, but I'm afraid your definition of fairly and honestly differs from mine. Hargrave nodded to one of his men who stepped forward with a document. This is a warrant for the arrest of Winter Fox fugitive from the Pine Ridge Reservation. Also warrants for the arrest of Beckett and Kiona Shaw on charges of harboring said fugitive. Rains examined the papers, his heart sinking. They appeared official, complete with territorial seals and judicial signatures. These warrants are federal, he observed. Indeed, which means you're required to execute them immediately or be charged with obstruction of justice yourself. The trap was masterfully constructed. Even if the warrants were fraudulent and Rains suspected they were challenging them, would require legal proceedings that could take months. By then, whatever evidence Winter Fox carried would be long since destroyed. I'll need to verify these with territorial authorities, Rains said. Of course, but in the meantime, the fugitives must be apprehended. Hargrave's smile widened. I'm prepared to assist with that apprehension, as is my civic duty. Mrs. Dayton, who had been listening to this exchange with growing alarm, finally spoke up. Sheriff, are you going to let this man turn your office into his personal army? Hargrave turned toward her with obvious displeasure. Mrs. Dayton, I suggest you concern yourself with running your boarding house and leave law enforcement to the proper authorities. The proper authorities would be the sheriff, not some cattle baron with delusions of grandeur. The insult hung in the air like gunpowder smoke. Hargrave's men tensed hands, moving toward weapons, while Rains positioned himself between them and the elderly woman. That will be enough, Rains said firmly. Mrs. Dayton, perhaps you should retire for the evening. Perhaps I should, but first let me ask Mr. Hargrave a question. She fixed the cattle baron with a steady gaze. How many young women have to disappear before someone with real authority starts asking questions about your business practices? The accusation was direct and damning. Hargrave's mask of civilized behavior slipped completely, revealing the predator beneath. That, he said quietly, sounds very much like slander. Does it? Or does it sound like truth finally being spoken aloud? The standoff stretched taut as a bowstring. Everyone in the room understood that they had reached a point of no return. Whatever happened next would determine not just the fate of Beckett Kiona and Winter Fox, but the soul of Rollins itself. Miles away, climbing a treacherous mountain trail in the darkness, the fugitives pressed forward toward Denver and whatever justice they might find there. Behind them, the town that had been their home teetered on the edge of violence that would change everything. The battle for truth had begun in earnest, and before it ended, blood would be spilled and lives would be lost. But in the cramped confines of Mrs. Dayton's boarding house, two aging guardians of decency prepared to make their stand against the forces of corruption and evil. The war for the soul of Wyoming territory had begun. The mountain trail proved to be as treacherous as Sheriff Rains had warned, a narrow ribbon of loose rock and twisted timber that seemed to defy both gravity and common sense. In the pale moonlight, their horses picked their way carefully along ledges, barely wide enough for a single rider, while the wind howled through the peaks above them like the voices of the damned. "How much farther to the main road?" Dr. Mills called out, his voice nearly lost in the rushing air. "Another 10 miles, maybe 12, Beckett replied, studying the crude map Mrs. Dayton had sketched for them. "Assuming we don't lose the trail in the dark." Winter Fox rode silently behind them, the precious evidence secured in a waterproof pouch beneath her coat. Every few minutes she would glance back toward the valley they'd left behind, watching for signs of pursuit. So far, the night remained empty of everything but wind and shadow. "There!" Kiona said, suddenly pointing toward a flickering light in the distance. "Someone's following us." They reined in their horses and peered back along the trail they'd just traversed. Far below, barely visible through the trees, a line of torches wound its way up the mountainside like a glowing snake. "How many?" Beckett asked, his hand moving instinctively to his rifle. "Hard to tell from this distance. 8 or 10, maybe more." Kiona's voice was grim. "They're moving fast, too fast for this terrain." "Hargrave's men," Winter Fox said with certainty. "They know these mountains better than we do." Dr. Mills looked at the rough trail ahead, then back at their pursuers. "At this rate, they'll catch us before we reach the main road." "Not if we don't let them," Beckett replied, spurring his horse forward. "Come on, we need to reach Devil's Canyon before they close the gap." They pushed their mounts harder than was wise on such treacherous ground, but desperation lent urgency to their flight. Behind them, the torches continued their inexorable advance, growing larger and brighter with each passing hour. Devil's Canyon proved to be aptly named a narrow defile between towering cliffs, where the trail became little more than a ledge carved into living rock. A single misstep would send horse and rider plummeting hundreds of feet to the canyon floor below. "Perfect," Beckett muttered, surveying the terrain ahead. "We'll be sitting ducks if they catch us in there." "Maybe not," Winter Fox said thoughtfully. "If we can reach the far side and block the trail behind us." "Block it how?" She pointed to a cluster of boulders balanced precariously on the slope above the canyon mouth. "Rock slide. Make it look like natural erosion brought them down. It was risky. If they triggered the slide too early, they'd trap themselves. Too late, and Hargrave's men would be through the canyon before the rocks could stop them, but it was their only chance." "Do it," Beckett decided. "Dr. Mills, you and the women get through the canyon. I'll handle the rocks." "I'm staying," Kiona said firmly. "Kiona, I'm staying," she repeated with a tone that brooked no argument. "You'll need someone to watch for the signal." There was no time to debate. Dr. Mills and Winter Fox spurred their horses into the canyon, while Beckett and Kiona climbed toward the loose rocks above. The slope was steep and unstable, sending small avalanches of gravel cascading into the darkness below. There, Kiona pointed to a key boulder that seemed to be holding several larger rocks in place. "If you can shift that one." Beckett nodded and began working his way toward it, using his rifle barrel as a lever. The rock was larger than it appeared, wedged tight by years of erosion and the weight of the stones above it. Below them, the torches were entering the mouth of the canyon. In their flickering light, Beckett could see Hargrave himself leading the pursuit, his face set in lines of cold determination. "Now or never," Kiona whispered. Beckett threw his full weight against the lever, feeling the boulder shift slightly. Another push, then another, and suddenly the rock broke free with a grinding roar that echoed off the canyon walls. Above it, tons of stone and debris began their thunderous descent toward the trail below. The effect was immediate and devastating. The rockslide crashed down across the canyon mouth like a dam, sealing off the passage and trapping Hargrave's men on the wrong side. Shouts of anger and frustration drifted up from below, but the words were lost in the continuing rumble of falling stone. "That should hold them for a while," Beckett said with satisfaction. "How long?" Kiona asked. "Long enough if we're lucky. There are other ways through these mountains, but they'll add hours to their journey." They made their way carefully back down to the trail where Dr. Mills and Winter Fox were waiting with obvious relief. Beautifully done, Dr. Mills said. I thought we were finished for certain. We're not clear yet, Beckett warned. This just bought us time. Hargrave won't give up that easily. They resumed their flight through the mountains, pushing their exhausted horses as hard as they dared. The main road, when they finally reached it, seemed almost impossibly wide and smooth after the nightmare of the mountain trail. Denver's still 60 miles, Dr. Mills observed, consulting his pocket watch. We can be there by evening if we don't stop. We don't stop, Winter Fox said firmly. Not until the evidence is in federal hands. The morning sun was painting the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold when they encountered their first fellow travelers, a freight wagon heading south with a load of mining equipment. The driver, a grizzled man who looked like he'd seen every mile of hard country between California and Missouri, pulled up when he saw them. You folks look like you've been through hell, he observed. Everything all right, just in a hurry to reach Denver, Beckett replied carefully. The freighter studied their mud-stained clothes and exhausted horses with knowing eyes. Wouldn't happen to be running from Wilson Hargrave, would it, The question caught them off guard. Beckett's hand moved toward his gun, but the freighter raised his hands peacefully. Easy there, friend. I'm not working for Hargrave. Just the opposite, in fact. He leaned forward conspiratorially. Name's Tom Bradley. You might have heard of me? Dr. Mills straightened in recognition. Bradley, you ran against Hargrave's candidate for mayor a few years back. That's right. Had that unfortunate accident with my wagon right before the election. Bradley's smile was bitter. Been waiting ever since for a chance to pay Wilson Hargrave back for that kindness. What do you know about our situation? Kiona asked. Word travels fast in this territory, especially when it involves Wilson Hargrave getting his comeuppance. Heard you folks are carrying something that might finally put that snake in the ground where he belongs. Winter Fox clutched her bundle protectively. Perhaps. Well, then let me help you get where you're going. Bradley gestured toward his wagon. My freight can wait. Your business with the Federals can't. The offer was tempting. Bradley's wagon was larger and more comfortable than their horses, and they were all exhausted from the night's flight. But trusting a stranger, even one with apparent grievances against Hargrave, seemed risky. How do we know you're telling the truth? Beckett asked. Bradley reached into his coat and withdrew a folded paper. Because I've been carrying this for 3 years, waiting for the right moment to use it. The document was a detailed account of Bradley's accident, complete with witness statements and physical evidence proving that his wagon had been sabotaged. It was exactly the kind of meticulous record-keeping that would be needed to build a case against Hargrave. You've been investigating him too, Dr. Mills realized. Me and about a dozen other folks who've been on the wrong end of his business practices. We've all got pieces of the puzzle. Problem is, none of us had enough pieces to make a complete picture. Bradley looked meaningfully at Winter Fox's bundle. But if what you're carrying is what I think it is, then together we might have enough evidence to bring him down. Winter Fox finished. They transferred to Bradley's wagon, hiding their horses in a grove of cottonwoods where they could be retrieved later. The freight wagon moved faster than their exhausted mounts could have managed, and Bradley proved to be a wealth of information about Hargrave's operations. The trafficking is just part of it, he explained as they rolled toward Denver. Hargrave's been systematically taking over the entire territory, buying judges, intimidating honest officials, eliminating anyone who stands in his way. He wants to build himself a little kingdom out here with him as the undisputed ruler. How has he gotten away with it for so long? Kiona asked. Same way men like him always do, by making sure the people with power benefit from his crimes and making sure the people without power are too scared to speak up. Until now, Winter Fox said quietly. Until now, Bradley agreed. Question is, will it be enough? They reached the outskirts of Denver as the sun was setting, the city's gas lamps beginning to flicker to life across the sprawling valley. The federal courthouse stood like a fortress in the center of town, its imposing facade promising the kind of justice that territorial politics couldn't corrupt. Marshal Patterson's office is on the second floor, Bradley said as they approached the building. He's an honest man far as such things go. More importantly, he's got jurisdiction over territorial crimes and the authority to request Army support if needed. The courthouse was still busy despite the late hour, with clerks and officials moving through its corridors on various errands. They found Marshal Patterson in his office, a stern-faced man in his 50s, who listened to their story with the kind of professional skepticism that suggested he'd heard similar tales before. "These are serious accusations," he said finally after examining the evidence Winter Fox had brought. "If even half of this is true, we're talking about a criminal enterprise that spans multiple territories." "It's all true," Winter Fox replied simply. "Every photograph, every document, every name in that ledger." Patterson studied the photographs again, his expression growing darker with each image. "Where did you say these were taken?" "Various locations, remote ranches, abandoned mining camps. The locations are all documented in the ledger. And you believe Wilson Hargrave is the head of this operation?" "One of the heads," Dr. Mills corrected. "The evidence suggests a network of men across the Western Territories all working together." Patterson set down the photographs and leaned back in his chair. "Assuming I accept all of this as genuine evidence, and I'm not saying I do not yet, what exactly are you asking me to do about it?" "Issue federal warrants," Beckett said. "Authorize raids on the locations identified in the ledger, arrest the men responsible, and shut down the entire operation." "Just like that." Patterson's tone was dry. "You want me to start a war with some of the most powerful men in the territory based on the word of a few fugitives and some photographs that could have been taken anywhere?" The dismissal stung, but Winter Fox had been expecting it. "Marshal Patterson, how many federal officials have gone missing in the past 2 years?" The question caught him off guard. "What do you mean?" "I mean federal marshals, territorial judges, Army officers, men with the authority to investigate and prosecute territorial crimes. How many have died in accidents or simply disappeared while investigating certain individuals?" Patterson's expression shifted, becoming more guarded. "There have been some incidents. 7 federal marshals dead or missing in 18 months. Winter Fox continued relentlessly. 3 territorial judges transferred suddenly to distant posts after beginning investigations into territorial land deals. 2 Army officers killed in Indian raids that no tribe has claimed responsibility for. How do you know all this? Because we've been keeping track. Because we've been trying to find someone with enough authority and enough courage to act on evidence like this." Winter Fox leaned forward. "Marshal Patterson, you can verify every name, every date, every incident I just mentioned. The pattern is clear. Someone is systematically eliminating federal oversight in this territory." Patterson was quiet for a long moment, processing the implications. If Winter Fox was right, then the scope of corruption was far beyond anything he'd imagined. "Even if I accept your theory," he said finally, "I can't act on suspicions alone. I need proof that will stand up in federal court." "What about the ledger?" Dr. Mills asked. "Financial records, shipping, manifests, correspondence, isn't that proof? It's evidence, but evidence gathered illegally by people who had no authority to obtain it. Any defense attorney worth his fee would have it thrown out of court." The frustration in the room was palpable. They had traveled hundreds of dangerous miles, risked their lives to bring this evidence to federal attention, only to be told it might not be legally admissible. "So what do you suggest?" Beckett asked. Patterson stood and walked to his window, looking out at the darkening city below. "I suggest we find a way to make your evidence legally admissible. And I suggest we do it very carefully, because if Wilson Hargrave really is as powerful as you claim, then your lives are in immediate danger." "Our lives have been in danger since we decided to oppose him," Kiona pointed out. "Perhaps, but now you're in my jurisdiction under federal protection. That means something even if it doesn't guarantee your safety. As if to emphasize his point, the sound of multiple horses approaching echoed through the evening air. Patterson moved to his window and peered down at the street below, his expression growing grim. "Gentleman to see you, Marshal," his deputy called from the outer office. "Say it's urgent federal business." "How many gentlemen?" Patterson called back. "About a dozen, sir, well armed and very insistent." Patterson turned back to his visitors. "It appears Mr. Hargrave's influence extends farther than we thought." The confrontation that followed would be remembered as the moment when the shadow war for control of the Western Territories finally broke into the open. Wilson Hargrave himself strode into the marshal's office, flanked by men wearing federal badges that looked official enough to fool most observers. "Marshal Patterson," Hargrave said with cold politeness, "I believe you're harboring federal fugitives." Patterson remained seated behind his desk, projecting calm authority despite the obvious threat. "Mr. Hargrave, what brings you to Denver so urgently?" "The pursuit of justice, of course." Hargrave's smile was sharp as a blade. "These people have stolen federal evidence from a legitimate investigation, assaulted federal officers, and fled across territorial boundaries to avoid prosecution." "That's interesting," Patterson replied mildly. "What federal investigation would that be?" "The investigation into Apache terrorism and sedition that I've been conducting on behalf of the Bureau of Indian Affairs." Hargrave produced a set of official-looking documents. "I have full authority to apprehend these suspects and return them to territorial custody." Patterson examined the papers with professional thoroughness, noting discrepancies that suggested they were skilled forgeries, but challenging them publicly would require more evidence than he currently possessed. "These warrants appear to be in order," he said carefully. "However, I'll need to verify them with Washington before releasing any prisoners." "That won't be necessary," one of Hargrave's men interjected. "Federal fugitives take precedence over local jurisdiction." "Federal fugitives, yes, but not territorial prisoners with federal protection." Patterson's voice carried a note of steel. "These people have requested federal asylum while presenting evidence of territorial corruption. Until that evidence is properly evaluated, they remain under my protection." The standoff stretched taut between them. Hargrave's men outnumbered Patterson's deputies, but they were in the federal courthouse surrounded by the symbols and authority of legitimate government. Violence here would be treason, not just law-breaking. Marshal Hargrave said quietly, "I hope you understand the implications of interfering with a federal investigation." "I understand them perfectly. I also understand the implications of allowing territorial officials to intimidate federal witnesses." "Federal witnesses to what crimes?" Patterson glanced at Winter Fox, who gave him an almost imperceptible nod. The decision was made. "Conspiracy, kidnapping, human trafficking, and the systematic murder of federal officials." Patterson's voice rang with authority. "Evidence has been presented to this office alleging that you and your associates have been operating a criminal enterprise that spans multiple territories and has resulted in the deaths of numerous federal marshals and judges." The accusation hung in the air like a death sentence. Hargrave's mask of civilized behavior finally slipped, completely revealing the predator beneath. "Those are the ravings of savages and outlaws," he snarled. "No federal court would accept such testimony." "Perhaps not, but a federal grand jury will certainly have the opportunity to hear it." "You're making a mistake, Patterson. A career-ending mistake." "Maybe, but it's my mistake to make." The confrontation that followed lasted hours, with threats and counter-threats exchanged while lawyers were summoned and telegrams sent to Washington. In the end, it was the arrival of additional federal marshals from Colorado Springs that tipped the balance. Whatever influence Hargrave wielded in territorial politics, it didn't extend to the federal marshal service. "This isn't over," Hargrave warned as he was finally forced to withdraw. "You have no idea what forces you're opposing." "Then I guess we'll all learn together," Patterson replied. After Hargrave and his men departed, the marshal's office fell into an exhausted silence. The first battle had been won, but everyone understood that it was only the beginning of a much larger war. "What happens now?" Dr. Mills asked. "Now we build a case that will stand up in federal court," Patterson replied. "We verify every piece of evidence, track down every witness, and construct a prosecution that Hargrave's lawyers can't tear apart." "How long will that take?" "Months, probably, maybe longer." "And in the meantime," Kiona asked, "in the meantime you stay alive, because Wilson Hargrave has just learned that his entire empire is at risk, and men like him don't go quietly into federal custody." As night settled over Denver, plans were made for the protection of witnesses and the careful investigation of evidence. Federal marshals were dispatched to verify the locations mentioned in the ledger, while attorneys began the complex process of building a case that could bring down an entire criminal network. But in a hotel room across town, Wilson Hargrave was making plans of his own. If the federal government wanted to play by legal rules, he would show them what happened when those rules got in the way of real power. The battle for justice had begun in earnest, and before it ended, the very foundations of law and order in the Western Territories would be tested to their limits. Beckett and Kiona Shaw had started their journey seeking only the right to live according to their own consciences. Now they found themselves at the center of a struggle that would determine whether justice or corruption would shape the future of the American West. In the quiet of their federal protection, they held each other close and prepared for the storm that was coming. They had found something worth fighting for in each other and in the life they'd built together. Now they would discover if love and courage were enough to stand against the forces of organized evil. The war for the soul of Wyoming territory was far from over, but for the first time since that day at the auction block, hope seemed like more than just a dangerous luxury. It seemed like something they might actually be able to keep.